For months on end, the words reciprocal tariffs have dominated the headlines, and tomorrow, the US President Donald Trump is expected to announce a series of steps against all countries, including India, over what Washington considers unfair trade practices. In fact, the US calls it its Liberation Day. But beyond the rhetoric, what exactly are tariffs all about, and how will this impact India? Let me try and explain in simple terms. For starters, what are tariffs? What is a tariff? In its simplest form, a tariff is a tax on goods coming into or leaving a country. Now, tariffs are often imposed to protect domestic industry from foreign competition. So what exactly are America's concerns on Indian tariffs? America says we have high tariffs. Well, the US has concerns over India's high import tariffs, such as 150% on alcoholic beverages, 100% on coffee, raisins, and walnuts, 60% on automobiles. India's World Trade Organization bound tariff rates average a high of more than 113% for agricultural goods, but its applied rates average 17%. This allows sudden increases up to that higher limit of 113% without violating rules. America says that this big difference gives India the flexibility to suddenly raise tariffs whenever it wants, up to the higher bound of the WTA rules without breaking rules. This, America says, is unfair. India, America says, has strict import licensing requirements for remanufactured goods and refurbished medical devices, and that there are quantitative restrictions on pulses and boric acid imports. There are also non-tariff barriers like bans on animal origin oil and tallow. Mandatory domestic testing of telecom equipment, America says, despite international certifications, is essentially redundant, but America says India still insists on doing it. India, America says, has restrictive dairy import rules requiring certifications on animal feed content. Now, that's what America says. So how does India respond to this? And should India accept everything that the United States is demanding? Now, GTRI has come out with an analysis of what they think India needs to be worried about. So I'm referring extensively to their study here. Point number one, while the US pressures India to amend trade policies for American interests, India must evaluate each demand based on our own national priorities, development goals, and cultural values. The proposed US changes in agriculture, digital governance, and public health could jeopardize India's small farmers. It could jeopardize our food safety, our social norms, also our digital security. India remains open to reform and global cooperation, provided that it is fair, it is reciprocal, and respects sovereignty as a key concept. There is a true partnership between the US and India, but that cannot rest on one-sided demands. India will not sacrifice our policy space, our economic security, or public welfare to appease foreign interests, and that any reforms India does undertake must prioritize the well-being of our people over the profits of foreign corporations. Well, joining us now, Surjit Bhalla, former Executive Director of the International Monetary Fund. He's a senior economist and author, and great to have him on the program. Kawal Sibal, former Indian Foreign Secretary. Dan Gelchud, besides anything else, is known as America's accountant. And Rahul Ahluwalia, founder director of the Foundation for Economic Development. Surjit Bhalla, let me come to you first, because I think there's a lot of confusion on this. How will the proposed US tariffs set to begin on the 2nd of April affect our $74 billion annual exports to the US, particularly in key sectors like pharmaceuticals, textiles, and agriculture?
Before going into how it will affect, let me just state very simply, and you had mentioned about whether it is in our national interest what the Americans are asking us to do. It is very much in our national interest to have a sharp reduction in tariffs. So in other words, I think it is a blessing in disguise, maybe not in disguise, that Trump is asking us to open up our trade. Several economists for several decades have been arguing the same point. Let us open up. and therefore benefit from what trade brings up. One other point I want to make, that this treaties, etc., the USTA treaty, as well as the cut in import tariffs, there is also its investment and trade. And we have one of the most restrictive regimes in the world on FDI. Basically, we were averaging something like 2.5% of GDP of foreign direct investment, whether from America or from anywhere else. That has now collapsed to something like 0.8% of GDP. And why has it collapsed? Because we changed our rules about foreign direct investment, stating that when there's a dispute between the firms, then you have to go to an Indian judge in order to get the suit settled. So the Americans and every other foreign investor walked with their feet, exited India. So Indians don't go to an Indian judge or don't want to go to an Indian judge.
All right, I take a lot of the points that you're saying. I'll come back to you in a moment. Dan Geltrude, I hear what Surjit Bhalla is saying. The flip side of the argument is, of course, that India would want to protect our agriculture sector, our small farmers. Another sector which we may want to protect, for example, is our pharma industry. We are called the pharma capital of the world. How might US tariffs on Indian generic drugs, that's a critical export worth about $8 billion, impact both Indian pharma companies and American healthcare costs? And what diversification strategies, if any, do you potentially see a country like India pursuing?
So when you look at a trade war overall, you definitely are going to have unintended consequences on both sides. So as we've been talking about, President Trump is talking about having reciprocal tariffs, meaning whatever one country tariffs, the other country tariffs the same way. So if we specifically focus in on pharmaceuticals, what's going to happen is that pharmaceuticals that are exported out of India are going to become more expensive. On the American side of that, that means the potential for those drugs to be more expensive. On the Indian side, what you're going to see is probably a reduction of those exports because they're too expensive. So you have both sides experiencing some pain here. What I believe, and I think this is a positive here, is that President Trump and Prime Minister Modi have a good working relationship. Our countries are allies, right? Let's keep in mind that the common adversary is China. It's not between the two of us. So this is simply a matter of, you have on one side America first, you have on the other side India first. We have to find some common ground. Maybe everyone's not going to be exactly happy, but it will be more fair where the United States can pull back on what would, be harmful tariffs to India. This situation is workable. We have to get both sides at the table to negotiate it out.
Okay. Ambassador Sybil, it seems that India, if you accept what Donald Trump said a little while back, India may well, cut down on certain tariffs. There appears to have been some sort of progress. Given the depth of the relationship we have with Washington now, do you believe that by and large, this is an issue which can be resolved?
Well, it will have to be resolved. How it gets resolved, on what terms, and what is the price we may pay will be seen as time goes by. The whole narrative and the foundation of the argument of President Trump and the Americans is false. America is the world's largest economy, $31.5 trillion economy. We are barely $4 trillion economy. So there is no equality. Now, you can't sort of simply narrow down the entire relationship between India and the United States to the issue of tariffs and leave out all the other great advantages the United States has in the world economy. beginning with the dollar as a reserve currency and its ability to actually weaponize the global financial system to its advantage. And whatever the Fed does in terms of its fiscal policies or monetary policies has immediately an impact on the world. The fact that Trump has decided that he's going to raise tariffs on all countries has created commotion all over the world. Look at the power the United States has and the US president has. If he takes a decision of this kind, which is totally against the WTO and international trade rules, nobody is actually so concerned about that. Now they are all flooding around to see if they can somehow adjust to the new initiatives that President Trump has been taking on tariffs. In our case, if Trump argues that this is in U.S. national interest, there are also Indian national interests. And there has therefore to be some kind of a compromise between the two countries where the core national interests of the two sides are reasonably protected. It just cannot be a one-way street.
Yep.
And these bullying tactics that we see that are coming from President Trump, I may say they're not simply directed at India. They're directed at all the major partners of the United States. Actually, we are 10th in terms of countries with a large deficit with the United States. China has a 24% deficit, surplus. European Union has an 18% surplus. Vietnam, Canada, all these countries, Mexico, they have much higher surpluses with the United States. Our surplus is only about 4%. So we are not in the same league, but somehow we are being targeted, and President Trump repeatedly says India is a tariff king, and he's created this narrative and put us on the defensive. And all of us are seeing, like the government, the policy makers, economists and others are seeing how we can somehow protect our interests and satisfy President Trump and ward him off from the steps he may take tomorrow. I think the jury is out. He's not going to make any special dispensation for India. Let's see what he does, whether he will raise the tariffs on the U.S. side to match Indian tariffs, which will be very unfair across the board. The last point is,
Ambassador Sibal, hold on.
The last point is that if Trump feels that to protect national interests, he has to raise tariffs, then the contradiction in this argument is that he wants India to lower tariffs. You can't have it both ways.
Yes. Rahul Ahluwalia, just to the specifics, and I started by trying to get an idea on this pharma, textiles, and agriculture. Is it possible to quantitatively predict some sort of an impact on Indian industry in these sectors?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, we should expect if tariffs do go up, prices will rise, and we should expect lower purchases from Indian goods. But I would urge us to focus on Surjit's argument, right? And I think he has it exactly right. Tariffs and national interest should not be linked. Tariffs are in the interests of narrow business interests. It is not in the national interest, right? Tariffs protect inefficient firms and inefficient sectors. They do not protect efficiency and national strength, right? Even agriculture as a sector, for example, right? We have massively distorted markets because of a legacy set of issues, right? If the tariffs can help us drive through reforms that we need, our farmers will benefit, our agriculture sector will benefit. There is no reason that small landholdings in India should be given over entirely to wheat and paddy production. We should be focusing on horticulture, we should be focusing on vegetables. But just because of this legacy system that we have, we've never made this switch. We should definitely play this on the front foot and not on the back foot. We shouldn't be playing a defensive game here by trying to wriggle out of reciprocal tariffs. We should lower tariffs, we should reform our economy, and this is a massive opportunity for us. I know it's a cliche to say a threat is an opportunity, but it really is.
Mr. Bhalla, let me come to you next. One of the big problems that America has stated is that our WTO, our World Trade Organization bound tariff rates average more than 113% for agricultural goods, but the applied rate averages about 17%. In other words, we have the leeway to suddenly increase, right, tariffs in agriculture without violating the rules. This, they say, results in a great deal of unpredictability. How would you look at this American argument? Does that make sense? Because the counter argument would be that we need to protect our farmers and our agricultural sector is vulnerable at so many levels. So we need that leeway to protect our national interests.
Look, every country in the world protects their farmers. It's the degree to which you protect the farmers that needs changing. So we cannot come up with this argument that we need to protect our farmers, therefore we'll do this, and or refer to the WTO. As far as the WTO and agriculture is concerned, it's a mess. Okay, it is based on something in 1988. They haven't changed it, and everybody bends the rules, etc. The other side is non-tariff barriers, which we also apply en masse. And it is the non-tariff barriers that end up hurting an economy more than even the tariff barriers. So because they are obscure or we don't know how they are interacting, but they do interact. So I think it's a very simple proposition from India's point of view. That is, we have sought for a long time economic reforms, primarily in investment and trade. This is, as far as the government is concerned, a Trump-sent opportunity to correct the system and say, look, we have to, some interest group comes up and says, why are you doing this? And you say, this is happening internationally. Every country has to adjust. And I think that's our option. Rather than look into, okay, we are being treated unfairly, somebody else is being treated unfairly, or we are the victim, let's not play the victim card.
Okay.
We have our industrialists are very, very protectionist oriented. And, I'd written a piece called The Deep State in India, which is really protecting the interests of the major industrialists. So let's not cater, as I think Rahul Ahluwalia also mentioned, for the protection of the profits of our industrialists. We want this game will help in terms of equity, in terms of efficiency, in terms of distribution. No matter what criteria you bring up with, it is going to help us in order to cut tariffs and to reduce non-tariff barriers.
Ambassador Sibal, you want to respond to that?
We should say, thank you very much.
Ambassador Sibal?
Well,
you're telling
it's
us.
very easy to talk in general terms and in theoretical terms. Very easy to say on television, we should not protect our farmers. We should move them away from paddy and wheat to horticulture and other things. This is precisely what Prime Minister tried to do with his reforms that he wanted to introduce. And look at the massive, massive political problem we face. Point is, it's not at all easy in our democracy to actually alienate the farmers who form the bulk of the voting public to the point where actually it can affect the politics of the country very seriously. And we're continuing to face agitation from the farmers even now. Number two, which country, democratic country, does not function on the basis of protecting the interests of its top industrialists? In America, this is happening all the time. Look at the kind of power that Elon Musk is enjoying within the American system. And all of us know how behind the scenes the big American corporations actually determine US policy on so many fronts. And number three, that look, we have to take into account what our national interest is. And I agree that wherever we need to reform, we should undertake those reforms. And this may be an opportunity in some areas to undertake those reforms. But this does not mean that we should be cowed down so much that entire mindset changes, and we are willing, therefore, to make compromises which may not be in our interest.
Okay.
And finally, if we have a deal with the United States, it should be a win-win situation. It shouldn't be something
where actually the biggest gainer ultimately may be China, because the United States doesn't have that kind of manufacturing prowess anymore. It doesn't. What it can sell to India would be at very high cost. It may not be competitive, and other countries may actually enjoy the lowering of barriers by our side. Therefore, we should wait for this multi-sector trade agreement with the United States, which can be taken out of the MFN format, and where we can ensure that the American companies get more access to the Indian market and can gain from it with some reciprocal advantages from us.
Got it. Ambassador Sybil, I'm running short on time. Dan Geltrude, Ambassador Sybil briefly mentioned China. In the context of tariffs, is it the tariff war between China and America which is actually going to dominate the headlines tomorrow? Perhaps the clearest clash in recent times is going to be economic. And it's essentially the US versus China on tariffs.
I agree with you on that. I think the obviously with all the reciprocal tariffs that are going to go in place tomorrow, many countries are going to be impacted, and we're going to have to see how those play out. But when we specifically talk about the United States and China, that's the big battle. Those are the two world economic powers that are going to be clashing. And I believe, and I said earlier, that when you look at the United States with India, we need to work together because we have a common adversary in China. When you talk about countries that are operating for their own benefit and everybody is going to put their country first, I think when you look at China, they go above and beyond in terms of trying to exercise their influence around the world. And the question becomes, are they using that influence fairly? My personal position in all of this is that trade needs to be fair and equitable, in spite of who may have a larger economy. We can't control outcomes. That's for the countries to compete. What we can control is the fairness and the playing field being level and everyone having the opportunity to compete fairly.
Okay. Rahul, last word to you. Are there some low-hanging fruit over here? Alcoholic beverages, India's high import tariffs at 150%, 60% for automobiles, 100% on coffee, raisins and walnuts. Can India fix this to a large extent? It does seem unfair.
Absolutely. And I think we have to keep in mind that the different countries have different advantages, right? That's the basis of trade. That's why trade is a win-win situation always, right? America can produce different things with different efficiency, and India can produce different things with different efficiency. The kind of small cars that Indians love to buy are just not made in America and cannot be and will not be made in America, right? So America produces top-end automobiles, which we don't necessarily make. And so we can easily make these relaxations without suffering from our industrial base, right? So we have to be relatively more careful with countries that are at a similar income level as ours. With a country that has an income level that is, I think, close to 50 times ours, on a per capita basis, they produce an entirely different basket of goods. So if it's just a free trade agreement with America, we should be all for it. There is almost no sector in which India has to worry.
No, but Rahul, just one follow-up question. There are certain areas where India, it seems, will never bend. For example, poultry imports or dairy imports. Yeah. The concern is that dairy imports to India will not be allowed if the poultry has been fed meat in the United States. We've got our own cultural, religious, concerns. And that's something we won't bend on. So
I think on food and agriculture, we can take a studied approach. I don't think we should protect products. We should protect people, right? So farmers can be supported with DBT instead of having these sort of product level issues.
Right.
DBT, we have such a robust DBT structure now. There is no reason why we cannot switch social security to that. And about this kind of poultry having eaten meat, this is the kind of thing that people can make up their minds about. You require disclosure of information on the product, and people who don't have a problem with it can go ahead and eat the poultry. People who have a problem with it can continue to eat Indian poultry. This is not the kind of thing, again, we should not protect products, we should protect people.
All right.
And that's my view. Yeah.
All right. Well, look, I'd like to thank you all very much for joining us. Two fairly contrarian positions over here, but I take Ambassador Sybil's words when he says that, look, this has to be a win-win for both sides.